Today we're going to talk about something really interesting, meetings. Now, do we have a lot of meetings? Probably we have more than 100 million meetings every day just in the US. Many of them are great, many of them are not very good. And we're going to talk about that today, how to improve them. We have the world leading specialist, Stephen Rogelberg. Warm welcome.
Oh, it's so good to be here.
Great. And you're coming to Oslo to have this meeting.
I am. And this is a meeting I wanted to have.
That's good. Now, how come you became interested in this?
Oh my gosh. I have no idea other than just the sheer frustration of having a day filled with meetings and not feeling like I accomplished anything. And my concern was, is that a shared feeling amongst the millions and millions of people out there working? And the answer is yes. When you have days full of meetings, you just end that day feeling more drained, feeling like you have yet more work to do, and yet you don't have that sense of accomplishment.
What's the key to a successful meeting? Because some of them are successful, right? Sometimes we come out of a meeting and said, wow, that was good. What's the key to that?
So there's a host of keys. It starts with intentionality. So what we have found in our research is the best meeting leaders have something in common. And what they have in common is the mindset of being a good steward of others' time. And when you think of yourself as a steward of others' time, you become intentional with your meeting choices. You design the meeting with intentionality. You facilitate the meeting with intentionality, and you close the meeting with intentionality. And interestingly, we have this stewardship mindset when we're meeting with critical stakeholders, but when we're meeting with our team or peers, we tend to step back and not act like a steward. So we will talk about some of that intentionality, I'm sure, in terms of specific choices, but it definitely starts with this mindset that if people leave your meeting saying that it was a waste of time, that is so uncomfortable to you that you try to do things to prevent it.
When should we call a meeting in the first place?
Meeting should be called when there's a compelling purpose that requires interaction and engagement. If you don't need interaction and engagement, then you don't need to bring people together, right?
Should we have them regularly in the diary? Should we just have them every Monday? Bang, bang, meet this person.
If there's a compelling reason to do that, but we just don't want to meet out of habit, which is what calendars are being filled with, right? It's just habits, and habits are tough to break. So we definitely want to be more thoughtful that we only schedule a meeting when there's absolute criticality to do so.
When should we just send an email instead?
So let me give you...
Because some emails should probably be meetings and some meetings should be emails.
I think it keeps going back to the need for engagement with the content. That really is what, if you need engagement with the content, meetings are a perfect mechanism. So let me give you a technique. Let me tie this to a technique. And we all know the importance of creating an agenda. Well, I have an alternative approach to agendas, and it speaks to when you should have a meeting and when you should not. So instead of framing your agenda as a set of topics to be discussed, what I want to challenge folks to do is create an agenda as a set of questions to be answered. By framing your agenda as a set of questions to be answered, now you have to step back and really think, why am I having this meeting? It's to address these questions. By framing your agenda as questions, you have a better sense of who has to be there. They're relevant to the questions. By framing your agenda as questions, you now know if the meeting has been successful, the questions have been answered. And if you just can't think of any questions, it likely means you don't need a meeting.
Absolutely. Now, you have something called the steward mindset.
Right.
What is involved in that?
So that is just this notion that you are inviting people. You are asking people to give you the greatest gift that we all have, our time. And by asking for that, you want to honor that time. You want to make sure that investment is meaningful to them and to you. So when you have that stewardship mindset, you are trying to create good choices, that intentionality to elevate this meeting time so that people feel at the end that it wasn't a drain, but instead a gain.
Who should be in a meeting?
The people that should be in the meeting are critical to answering the questions of interest.
Because during COVID, when we were at Teams, we kind of included everybody, left, right, and center, in order not to offend anybody.
That's right.
Nobody should feel excluded. Everybody should be part of it,
Meeting.
And I think we just kind of continued that philosophy.
Exactly. This desire to increase meeting size comes from three forces. The first force is a force of goodness. You just want to include people, so you invite them, right? That's coming from a good place. The second force is laziness, right? It's very easy for us just to hold captive people's calendars and invite them to a meeting, right? So we're not thoughtful or deliberate. We just say, when in doubt, invite. The third force is insecurity. Namely, as people became working more remote, leaders just didn't have that confidence that they were actually managing. So how do they express their management? You bring them into a meeting. And so these meetings just keep increasing in size.
What's the optimal? Is there like a max size of a meeting?
It depends if you're trying to accomplish genuine interaction. If you really want to create interaction, more than 8 people is super hard. You have to be a very skilled facilitator.
Yeah. How long should they be?
They should be as long as absolutely is necessary, given what you're trying to answer.
But they tend to fill up the time they have.
Exactly. Right? So there's something called Parkinson's Law.
Yeah.
And Parkinson's Law is the idea that work expands to fill whatever time is allotted to it. Yeah. So a meeting scheduled for 60 minutes will take 60 minutes. But we can actually use that science to our advantage. If we schedule a meeting for 25 minutes, we will get it done. In fact, the research shows that if you identify a meeting time and then decrease it by around 5 minutes, it actually creates positive pressure and more focus, and those groups perform better.
That's interesting. Now, how do you make meetings good? How do you make them engaging?
So it starts from that agenda and that intentionality, so that questions-based approach. When you frame your agenda as questions to be answered, people will be drawn into it, right? We, as early as young school kids, we are drawn to answer questions. So when we frame it as questions, and then when the leader starts the meeting, what was so interesting in the science is that the leader's mood is actually the best predictor of the meeting's mood. So if you come in there in a negative mood state, it pervades the meeting and it affects engagement and openness to new ideas. So the meeting has to start well. The leader has to recognize that they are a host, right? They called everyone together. So what does a host do? A host welcomes people, a host makes introductions, a host expresses gratitude, and helps people make separation from what they were doing before they walked into the meeting and then into the meeting itself. And then once that meeting is going, that leader is facilitating, right? If you invited someone to this meeting, it's because you wanted to hear what they had to say. So that leader is dialed in and saying, oh, I haven't heard from you, Gordon. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Or Sandy, I know you were working on something similar, right? So they're helping bring the voices out. They're encouraging conflict of ideas, right? So they're doing all that. And then when the meeting is coming to a conclusion, they help promote an ending.
The common thing is that the most senior person speaks the most, right? Unfortunately.
That is. And what has generally been found is these most senior folks who talk the most, they are not picking up on the meeting dynamics. When you do a lot of talking, you love it. You think this is great. The more people talk, the better they feel about the experience. So these leaders leave.
And the more senior you are, the more endorphins you get from hearing your own voice.
Exactly. Yeah. So they leave the meeting saying this was great, but everyone else doesn't feel the same.
How do you get, what's good listening? Who's a good listener? I think it's interesting. Sometimes you give a speech or a seminar or something, and some people in the audience are just better listeners, and you can just see it. I think it's the way they nod, I guess.
So listening has multiple components. So let me answer that question by telling you a related piece of science, which I think speaks to it. Have you noticed that when people make introductions, you learn someone's name, next thing you know, you've forgotten it?
Sure.
And so there were studies to look at this. And basically, one of the principal reasons, well, there's a couple principal reasons we don't remember the names, is one, we don't really care. We don't really care. So that now tells us one key clue to listening is caring what that person says.
Yep.
The second reason we often forget the names is because we are rehearsing what we're going to say while that person's introducing themselves. So active listening is all about caring, truly engaging with what that person has to say, taking as a challenge to truly, fully engage with their words. So the types of utterance such as, help me understand, tell me more, what are your thoughts, right? These are all overt attempts to truly engage with another person's content, and that's where listening takes part.
You mentioned the importance of kind of conflicts in meetings. So we had Ed Catmull, who was the founder of Pixar, on the podcast, and he talked about Steve Jobs. I mean, they co-founded Pixar together. Steve Jobs, he sacked 2 board members at Pixar because they never disagreed with him in meetings. And he said, if you don't disagree, you're not adding anything to this company. So how do you create an environment where people feel okay to disagree?
Yeah, that's great. We definitely want conflict in meetings, but we want conflict of ideas, not conflict of personalities.
Yeah.
And to create a culture where conflict occurs of ideas, it starts with the leader expressing values that this is actually what they want, right? So many meeting leaders never express what their hopes are in this meeting. But if you start the meeting saying, we have some important things to talk about that there's no way we all 100% agree. So we want people to go to battle over ideas, right? So create the expectation. Then once that meeting happens, encourage it, right? So you can make comments. Sasha, what is the alternative perspective on this? Give me something different, right? So the facilitation can help keep promoting alternative perspectives. And then I want to share one other way, because this next way is the most different. One of the greatest ways of creating conflict in meetings is silence. Namely, if groups interact with no voices and basically are just typing into a document. So for example, let's say we're brainstorming around alternative approaches to penetrate a market, right? We could do that with our mouths, or we could type into a shared document with everyone putting in their ideas and then adding comments on others' ideas. When brainstorming is done with silence, the range of ideas is much greater, and you get so many different ideas. Because when you were doing it in silence, everyone could contribute at once, and they weren't being most influenced by the first voice they heard, because everything occurred simultaneous.
Interesting. How do you wrap up a meeting?
That's such an important question. We know meetings end, but meetings often don't have an ending. And the best meetings have an ending. Basically, with 5 minutes left or 3 minutes left, you stop. You stop. And you say, okay, we've had this conversation. We now need to wrap this up. Here's what we decided. For each of these things that was decided, we've identified the DRI, directly responsible individual. So therefore, no one leaves the meeting wondering what was decided and who's responsible. As part of that ending, you're also indicating outstanding issues that can be picked up at the next meeting. So this general wrap-up, right, this closing is so helpful, not only for the people attending, but also the people not attending. Namely, if you document that, it helps those people who are not attending feel it's okay that I wasn't there.
In this fund, we rate our meetings after the meeting, the leader group meetings. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
I lean good. But how we use the data, that needs to be a little bit more nuanced. So I'd have to learn a little bit more how you leverage those data. But here's why I think it's a good idea. As I mentioned earlier, leaders think they're much better at running meetings than others. So there's this disconnect. There's a blind spot that these leaders have. And when you have this blind spot, you're not very motivated to make changes, right? Because you think it's going well, so why would you change? You constantly believe that the meeting problem is everyone else, not you. So the feedback and the data are critical pieces for helping to provide awareness and enlightenment. So I love the idea of people getting some type of aggregated data on how they're doing in this role. Another way of carrying it out, by the way, is to go to your engagement survey. Is there any content on meetings in that engagement survey? And likely the answer is no. And that's a tremendous missed opportunity to build into your engagement survey reporting system content on how people are actually spending their time at work.
Should we be standing up?
Sometimes, but not always. So yes, the research generally shows that meetings standing up take nearly half as much time and produce the similar quality outcomes. So standing up was not a bad idea. But a long meeting, no one's going to want to be standing for a long period of time. No. So we just have to be thoughtful. But I think what's so important about your question and what it speaks to is that when you're leading a meeting, you have choices. There's lots of different ways you can run this meeting, right? You can do it in silence. You can have people stand up. You can have people get into pairs before they start talking as a group, right? You have a lot of things that you can actually make choices of that can elevate the experience. So step back and make a choice. At times, a 15-minute quick meeting where people are kind of coming together, a stand-up could be perfect. If you're having an 8-hour retreat, a standing up meeting is probably not the best choice.
That's probably right. Now, how does it differ online instead of in person? What are the things we need to be aware of?
Great question. Before the pandemic, virtual meetings were ranked very, very low, right? So face-to-face meetings were considered by attendees to be a much richer, better experience. But people have gotten better with virtual meetings. So we're seeing virtual meeting effectiveness increase over time. And basically, people's perceptions generally see it around the same now as face-to-face. Interestingly, virtual meetings have, in some ways, more potential.
Why?
Because the meeting room is inherently democratic, right? Everyone is on an equal plane in a virtual meeting. You don't have head of table effects, right? So it's an open forum, much more accessible for people. You have the access to chat, and chat has been shown to be a great mechanism for bringing more voices into the conversation. You also have these various plugins that allow for quick voting and consensus taking done anonymously. So you're not just influenced by the loudest voices, but you can quickly test consensus. So there's so many reasons that virtual meetings can excel and even be better than face-to-face.
Multitasking, what do you think?
What I think about multitasking?
Yeah.
I love multitasking.
In meetings.
Oh, in meetings. Multitasking is really intriguing because generally when people are multitasking in meetings, they're actually doing their work. They're actually doing their work. So it's a behavior that hurts the meeting, but helps the organization. It's crazy. It's a very interesting phenomenon. But multitasking is generally a symptom. It is a symptom of a bad meeting.
Yeah. So it's just boring.
Or you wonder why you're there.
Yeah. Stephen, we talked about kind of bigger meetings now, but you also written a book about one-on-one meetings.
I have.
You have for sure written books. That's great. Now, what is a one-on-one meeting and why are they important?
Thank you. Our days are filled with one-on-one encounters, but I'm talking about something different. So this book that I wrote, it's called Glad We Met, The Art and Science of One-on-One Meetings. When I'm talking about a one-on-one meeting in that context, what I'm talking about is a meeting that's facilitated and orchestrated by a manager with one of her or his direct reports, but it is a meeting not for the manager.
Yeah.
It is a meeting for that employee. It is a meeting for that employee to be able to express their thoughts and ideas and whatever's on their minds. The manager is just reacting to what the employee. It's a dedicated space to truly see your people. And the research on it is amazing. That when managers have these regular one-on-ones with their people, where they're not just asking for status reports, because again, that's for them, but they're trying to understand your challenges, your thoughts, your concerns, your opportunities, both short-term and long-term. When you fully engage with that person on their terms, these individuals tend to be more engaged. Your top talent tends to be more retainable. They feel more committed to the team and to the organization, and people are better coordinated.
And how often should you do them?
Well, we looked at that from two perspectives. First of all, we asked people, what is your preferred cadence to meet with your manager in this one-on-one meeting? And by far, it was weekly. Then we looked at the outcomes. So we examined how frequently you have them and then people's engagement on the job. It lined up perfectly. Weekly one-on-ones or every other week one-on-ones were associated with the best outcomes for the organization. When they're every month, the relationship doesn't have the continuity, right? The conversations become stale and disjointed. The story doesn't come through.
But a manager, how many one-on-one meetings or how many relationships should a manager have and have one-on-one meetings with, you think?
So you should be having one-on-ones with every single one of your direct reports.
Yeah.
Hopefully you don't have more than 10 direct reports. But here's the super good news. It's less about the amount of minutes in these one-on-ones and more about the regularity of it.
Right.
So if I give you 20 good minutes every week, that had the same positive outcomes as even if I gave you an hour. So as a manager looks at their calendar and goes, I don't have time to do one-on-ones, really the question is, if you don't have the time, you're going to lose your best people, right? If you don't invest in these relationships, the team won't thrive. We've all heard that adage that people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses. One-on-ones are your opportunity to prove to your people that you're not a bad boss.
Why do you think people are hesitant to have them then, if they are so no-brainer?
Because everyone is so pressed with time that they're constantly thinking of what type of meeting do I not need to have. Yeah. And the alternative title for my book that I didn't use, but I was tempted, was The One Meeting That Should Never Be an Email. Because that's really what a one-on-one is. I'm a big believer in looking at this notion of signals. As leaders, we are always sending signals to our people, signals about what's important to us and what's not. Think about the signal you send to your people when you do not have a one-on-one. You're sending the signal that they really don't matter that much to you.
Yeah. Well, we all need to be seen, right? So I guess it's part of that.
Exactly.
Where does mentoring come in here?
Mentoring fits perfectly with this whole concept of one-on-ones. Because a mentor is not someone generally that has a personal agenda in the conversation, right? A good mentor, a good coach, is helping to engage with a person on their terms. And so these one-on-ones are absolutely an opportunity to provide mentoring and coaching. But the employee is opening the door for it, right? So you don't go into these meetings with a manager saying, oh, I have some feedback for you. But the manager can say, is there anything that I can share some feedback? Are there any topics or anything that you want me to share feedback on, right? So they have the door available to the individual, but the employee gets to drive. And the more that we drive in that feedback process, the more we accept the feedback and internalize it, right? When you're mentoring or coaching someone in these one-on-ones, if the employee says, I'm having this particular problem, now the manager can say, oh, here's a solution to the problem. A mentor would say, well, what are your thoughts on how to address that problem?
In your mind, is a mentor from the same company or an external mentor the better choice?
It could be either one. It really depends on the role in question, generally, and how new the employee is to the organization itself. But generally speaking, most mentors can emerge internally. For some types of high senior roles where benchmarking with other competitors or other organizations could be particularly helpful, an external mentor could be better.
Stephen, this has been a really, really good meeting. We could not have done it by email. It's been really, really exciting, engaging. I'm wrapping it up, hopefully in a good way, and look forward to staying in touch.
Well, I appreciate it. And I will say this. So we talked about the characteristics of a great meeting, and we emphasize this notion of stewardship. You have been a fabulous steward, right? You came into this meeting, you were well prepared, you read my content, you listened, you engaged. I thank you so much for participating and being such a great partner in this content.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.